before Columbus went westwards and discovered, and I'm very much putting those enthusiastically in air quotes, which you can't see, but I am very enthusiastically putting them in air quotes because obviously he didn't. But before Columbus, the most regular maritime trade routes were across the Mediterranean Sea. And then I mentioned about going down Africa and then going into the Indian Ocean, which, if you look at this map, is to the right of Africa. And then from across the Indian Ocean into the South China Sea. Now, this means that they can get to the start point of the Silk Roads in India and China by sea rather than by land. And you might think, well, that's a long way to go, a very difficult way to go compared to by going over land. And you'd be right, it is further, but the big thing is that transport by sea is a lot cheaper than transport by land. And spices were the most important cargo. So you can get a lot more spices on a boat and sail it than you can on the back of a yak and walk it. Now, up until the 15th, 16th centuries, these trade routes of luxury goods in the Indian Ocean have been controlled by Muslims. They transported them as far as Cairo in Egypt or Constantinople, where they were taken over by Christian merchants, usually Italian. But the Westerners wanted to find access that cut out the Muslims as middlemen. So there was the Portuguese, as I mentioned, that started the trend of sailing down Africa to find an alternative route to the east to avoid the Muslims acting as middlemen. So 1497 was a big year when, with the backing of the Portuguese King Manuel, Vasco da Gama sailed along the Western Africa coast until he found a pilot who knew the Indian Ocean, and he got around the very southern tip of Africa called the Cape of Good Hope, and he sailed directly across the Arabian Sea to Calicut in modern-day India. He left with a lot fewer spices than he expected because he ended up being resisted and in a bit of a tussle with Arab merchants, but he came back and he started the ball rolling. Funnily enough, if the reason why getting around the coast, the bottom of Africa was difficult is because you might think you'd like follow the coast of Africa and sail around. And medieval boats were built that they stayed quite close to shore. So bad weather meant you could pop into whatever harbour was nearby for some shelter. So the technology of these boats was not that they could sail very far from coast. And to get around the bottom of Africa without just being completely swept onto the rocks and being shipwrecked, you actually have to join one of the currents. Is it the Benguela or Anguilla current? It begins with A or a B. Anyway, and you join this current and it actually acts like a conveyor belt, sucking boats away out into the Atlantic, away from the coast of Africa. So the opposite direction that you think you should go in, and then it suddenly cuts and swerves you along the south of the very southern tip of Africa. So it was actually, they got blown off course, they got sucked into this current by accident and then realized, oh, this is how you do it without getting shipwrecked. It's contrary to intuition. So that's why it took them so long. So let's have a little look at what kind of activities these Europeans were up to between Europe, Africa and Asia, the other side of the Indian Ocean. There is a fantastic case study for us to consider, and this comes from the modern country of Namibia. Now that's marked on the map here. The little dot with the A is where it was found. This stretch of Namibia is called the Skeleton Coast, and that gives you a hint as to how many shipwrecks would end up there. The cool thing about this shipwreck is that it was discovered during diamond mining. This is an area of the world where a lot of the world's diamonds come from. The diamonds are eroded by the Orange River, upriver in the mountains, and then they wash downriver and out into the sea. And so what they do here on the coast between Namibia and South Africa is that they dredge the sand to look for diamonds. So off they were, dredging the sand, looking for diamonds, and instead found a perfectly preserved shipwreck. Not a diamond. So they had the sense to call in a team of archaeologists to come and investigate exactly what this shipwreck was. It is a Portuguese merchant ship from the 1530s. And it's like a great big time capsule. It sank, it still had everything on board, 40 tons worth of cargo. By analysing the cargo, we think the ship was traversing the route between Europe and India. This ship was therefore going down the coast of Africa, probably, by the signs of it, did not catch the current quite right, and ended up too close and getting shipwrecked. But it planned to go around the bottom of Africa and then up across the Indian Ocean. So it's full of things that Europe was sending to Asia. So this shipwreck's like a big time capsule. It tells us about the sailors' lives, it tells us about the trade, the voyages, the cargo, and the network. So it tells us loads of really, really neat things as historians. I'm only going to highlight a few of these, and then you can read more yourself, linked to the article on Moodle. So on the left here is a photograph of the archaeologists with just some of the copper ingots that they found. They found 18 tons of copper ingots. Why this? Well, the Portuguese had to provide something to buy spices in the east with. So they brought 18 tons of copper ingots with which to buy spices. These ingots all have a crest stamped on them. That is the Fuggers family crest. If you're like, Fuggers, silly name. You might have laughed at a Fugger being a silly name last week because it was the Fugger family that put up the money for Archbishop Albert of Mainz to raise money to buy his diocese, that led to the Indulgence campaign, that led to Martin Luther getting very angry, that led to Martin Luther writing his 95 Theses. So here's the Fugger family again. This time they're German, but they're investing in Portuguese trade. So that tells us about long distance cooperation for financial gain. There are also bars of lead, bars of tin, and bars of pewter, presumably for the same reason. On the right, we've got ivory. Now, in the past, we've talked about walrus ivory, but this is Africa. This is elephant ivory, and actually some hippopotamus ivory too, because hippo ivory was particularly prized in India. Now, as we know, elephants and hippopotamuses do not live in Portugal, naturally. So it's likely that since I had all of this ivory on board, that the ship had actually already stopped somewhere off in Africa already, had picked up this ivory and hippo ivory somewhere else in West Africa, and then continued southwards. So what they're trying to do now is look at the isotopes in these tusks to see what the beasties were eating and see if they can figure out exactly where they were captured from and their tusks taken from them. Now, as you might expect, we're going to find a gold, and I've just realized I've given away the question there, so I'm not going to flick onto that next slide. I'm going to show it to you after the video. They found a lot of gold coins on board. About 94% of the coins found on board were gold. Only 6% silver, some copper alloy. 90% of the gold coins were Spanish. Only 8% Portuguese, but there were also French, Arabic, and Venetian ones. Coins are cool to find because they give you dates, because you can see like who's on them. So this gives us a date that the Portuguese coins were minted about 1525. They were then in circulation until the late 1530s. They had to be removed from circulation because they had such a high gold content, meant that people in other countries collected them because of the gold. So that dates us to shipwreck. Therefore, most of the coins that they have are Spanish. They date from the late 15th to early 16th century, and a lot of them have depictions of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella, and those are the Catholic king and queen who were the ones who expelled the Muslims from Granada and ended the Reconquista. Most of the silver coins are the Portuguese ones. Why the money? Well, they needed to finance the age of exploration. But it also shows that this involved international cooperation that might have been behind of it. Okay, going to leave it here. You're now going to go and answer some questions, and then I'll pick up with my third and final video.